afternoon, everybody. This morning's Overflight, we saw that the original flow front was still active but moving very, very slowly. However, that finger that was to the south side that was advancing has now become theoretically the new flow front because it has extended beyond the original flow front. It's still very narrow. It extended or advanced approximately 100 yards since yesterday. And it's moving in that northeast direction, again, towards the general vicinity of Pahoa Street, the whole community. So it's still very narrow, moving over the last 24 hours about 100 yards and in that northeast direction. There was very little fire activity and burning this morning. A lot of smoke, though, as far as not necessarily from the flow, but because we had a south wind, a lot of the emissions from both Pahoa and Halimama were coming down across Lower Puna and into Hilo. So the limited smoke from the lava flow combined with the fog created some hazy conditions out there this morning with a south wind pushing it towards Hilo. And we're just tracking that and staying in close contact with HBO.
Do you have a approximate distance of the new flow front from Pahoa Street and the transfer station?
Yeah, it's still at about 0.6 miles because even though it advanced 100 yards, if you recall, this finger was actually behind or upslope from the original head or full front. So it's caught up and it's moved a little further. And we're like rounding these numbers because it's actually 0.58 some odd miles. So we're just rounding it still too close to 0.6.
So it's pretty close to the original flow leading edge then.
Yeah,
in terms of distance from Pahoa Street.
Yeah, if you saw a picture, you'd see that it didn't advance much further than the original flow front. I would have to estimate maybe 30 to 50 yards max in ahead of the original flow front. But it is obviously taking over and now nosing ahead.
I know HBO is not on the call. Is there any forecast on when the new leading edge might reach Pahoa Street?
You know, they've been really conservative as far as throwing out dates when it'll reach, just because the flow activity, its forward movement has been fairly inconsistent as well as very slow. So until such time that they feel that the flow movement is, fairly predictable and consistent, they're going to try to, give us their best estimate, but it's not something they're going to publish right away. So I think they're still working on what's the best way to put that out there because, we're all very sensitive to the frustration the community goes through when we throw out a date and people look at that in some cases as the absolute and it doesn't happen and it changes. It can be very frustrating and disconcerting. So that's one of the things we've really stressed with the community at all the meetings is this will be a very frustrating process. And when we put dates out there, that just adds to it. So I think HBO is trying to find what's the best tool to give timelines without creating too much frustration for the community. But theoretically, if you really wanted to, you could just take the current distance and based on 100 yards since yesterday, if you were to average that as 100 yards per day, you could figure that out. But that's not necessarily the rate that it's going to stay at, and it's not necessarily going to provide for an accurate timeline as when it would hit the road.
Daryl, Denise Bateman here. I have a question for you. At what point would civil defense perhaps shut down a Pahoa road, like when the lava gets within a tenth of a mile, a quarter of a mile, 100 yards? Do you guys have a point?
Not necessarily a distance, but more the hazards associated with the flow. If we start to see, let's say over the next few days, for some reason we'd have some very dry weather and we start having some brush fire activity, we may be closing the road because of the fire hazards rather than the lava flow actually approaching the roadway. The other thing is and this would be applicable maybe more for when the flow moves into the populated areas, but if we ever experience any kind of hazardous materials involved in the burning with the flow, that would then extend also the distance downwind which we might want to evacuate or close roads. One of the things that we've shared with you folks at the Big Island Press Club is that, once the flow becomes obviously visible to the community or visible to people on the roadways, that's going to add another hazard to the dimension with traffic congestion, people walking on roadways with cars driving by. So all of these things are being considered in decisions as far as when we might close the road to include if we're going to manage or restrict access to viewing with the lava as it approaches areas where it can become more accessible.